Let me say first, since inquiring minds want to know, hashtag Eden Walk. Good evening, I'm Ann Marie Lipinski. I'm the curator of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism here at Harvard, and it is just a thrill to be with you all this evening. Several years ago, I was having dinner with Paul Salopek and two other journalist friends, talking about both the difficulties and the possibilities for this craft we loved. We had paid the bill and were about to part when Paul said he had an idea. He took out a pen, turned over the restaurant receipt, and drew a crude map of the world. "I'm thinking about walking across the globe," he said, retracing the path of human migration out of Africa. His pen started in East Africa, crossed Central Asia to China, traversed the Bering Strait from Siberia to Alaska, then stretched the length of the Americas, resting finally in Patagonia. It took seconds for him to sketch his plan. In reality, he estimated that night that it would be a 22,000-mile journey that would take 6 to 7 years. I tucked the map away and took it home. I had known Paul for a very long time and knew to pay special attention whenever he said, "I have an idea." His idea 15 years ago to document the Human Genome Diversity Project opened up the mapping of the world's shared genetics to a vast lay audience, deconstructing one of the century's most important scientific endeavors and earning him a Pulitzer Prize for explanatory journalism. His idea to physically track a crude oil shipment from across the world to its destination in a tank of a single SUV in suburban Chicago laid bare a global narrative stretching from corruption in Nigeria to the destruction of wetlands in Louisiana. To cover the war in Congo and reach its rebel-controlled regions, he had the idea to travel by canoe, providing first-hand witness and adding to a body of work on Africa that won him a second Pulitzer, this one for international reporting. In order to document the Northern Alliance's final push to Kabul, he and a photographer rode horseback over the snow-covered Hindu Kush into war-torn Afghanistan. And once, when I asked for a journalistic response to the global increase in child brides, it was Paul's idea to focus the lens narrowly in the central highlands of Ethiopia, where he found the story of Tihun Nabiu, the goat herder who didn't want to marry. In the story's opening scene, Tihun is dropping beetles down her dress so that they might bite her and make her breasts grow, providing evidence that she is mature enough to decide her own future. Tihun kneels in the dirt, eyes closed, an elfin figure whose smile is made goofily endearing by two missing front teeth, he writes. She holds her small hands over her nipples. She is waiting for the bug's enchantment to start. Seconds pass, but nothing happens. Eventually, she starts to giggle. The beetles have escaped by crawling up her neck. "It doesn't work," Tihun says, disgusted. She heaves an exaggerated sigh and squints out across the yellow grass hills surrounding her world. "I will just have to run," she says. But this is childish bluster, Paul writes. Tihun's short legs can't carry her away fast enough from the death of her childhood. Her wedding is 5 days away, and she is 7 years old. I share these stories because each is a classic Paul Salopek story. Narratives that transcend time, stitching us to distant peoples, decoding our most complex truths without ever oversimplifying or demeaning them. In Paul's stories, we are each of us yoked to the fate of all of us. For anyone who has been following his reporting, this ambitious next assignment is a natural extension of that work. This idea, sketched on the back of a restaurant receipt, is tonight formally launched as the Out of Eden Walk, a project he partly researched during a Nieman Foundation visiting fellowship at Harvard with key intellectual support from Harvard's Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology, the School of Education, MIT's Civic Media Lab, and others. It is a reporting project that, despite its unusual scale, 7 years of walking some 30 million footsteps across 39 borders, fits perfectly the nomadic yearnings of the migration he is tracing. It is also a more tightly woven and coherent expression of the deep and nuanced journalism that Paul has long practiced. And importantly, it is his journalistic response to two unsettling developments in his field: the erosion in global reporting coming from most American newsrooms, and the rise of foreign news content on the web that, he says, while innovative and promising, often seems politically influenced, superficially reported, fragmentary, and ahistorical. So the innovation here is, in fact, a reversal, a downshifting in pace to produce what Paul calls slow journalism. There are mapping technologies that could instantly and vicariously transport us across the migration that occupied 50,000 years of human history. There are communications tools to flood any one of our telephones with more news volume tonight than our ancestry received throughout time. But this atomization of the news, as he calls it, has left a hollow place. I'm hoping we can get rid of some of that clutter, Paul says, and spend time with the great policy stories, the great issues of our day, walking through them and examining them at 3 miles an hour. We're going to spend the rest of the evening hearing from Paul about his planning for Out of Eden and then posing some questions of him. But he first wants you to meet his editor on the Out of Eden project, Oliver Payne, who is the articles editor at National Geographic, where Paul's early stories will be published. Please join me in welcoming Oliver.
Thank you very much, Ann Marie, and thanks to the Nieman Foundation for hosting this very happy event tonight. A lot of my colleagues, a good number of my colleagues from the Society are here tonight, and we're all delighted and excited about this and to be here with you. I also want to thank the Foundation for doing what you did for Paul earlier this year, which is providing him that operational base, because it was absolutely crucial for the planning of this project. Now, Paul and I do go back a long way. We have, over the years, worked together on 5 feature stories in the magazine. But I want to take you back even earlier than that, to my first recollection of an editorial collaboration with Paul. It was almost exactly 20 years ago, and he'd very recently been hired as a staff writer for the magazine. Now, at that point in a young writer's career, that meant that he would be charged with almost exclusively writing captions for the stories, for the pictures. And we call these captions legends for some unknown reason, but that's what we do. So he was actually a legend writer. And I had just been installed as an editor. And I recall that that story that he wrote the legends for was about the decline of the songbirds in the US. It was a very gloomy subject. He was in my office with a researcher, which is what we call fact checkers at the National Geographic, and we were going over his copy, line by line, word by word, for accuracy. Now, there's one thing you need to know about researchers at the Geographic. They view a piece of copy as much like a juicy steak to be ripped into and demolished. Paul's copy was clean. This is the remarkable thing about this man. He takes pride in his work. He's an amazing reporter. I happen to think that this person in this room tonight is preeminent among foreign correspondents. As you, Ann Marie, have explained, his career at the Tribune took him into amazing places. But to get back to the songbird story, there were, of course, minor points that needed correction. So honcho editor man here would jump up and say, well, Paul, what about this for a fix? Paul would say, Ollie, that's good. And then he'd go silent. And there'd be this contemplative look on his face, and he'd go all intense in the Paul way. And he'd then come up, I could hear his mental thesaurus being riffled through, and he'd say, well, Ollie, what about this for a fix? And he'd put me right back into my box. But, yes, a very proud reporter, someone who stands behind his words. And actually, I realized from that occasion that this was a man with the voice of a poet as well. Now, he also has a very fast metabolism. And the Geographic back then had a notoriously and difficult slow metabolism for writers. In fact, one editor back in the day was famously heard saying that he believed the editorial staff of the magazine was made up of promising 50-year-olds. Paul couldn't wait, so off he went to Chicago where there were deadlines, and he had to write much all the time, and it did him the world of good. So now, fast forward, please, to 2010. And I have a story somewhat similar to yours, Ann Marie, but I think he'd progressed at that point beyond the napkin. He was in his cabin in New Mexico, I believe, wrestling the book to the ground, getting squirrelier, if that's a word, more and more squirrely every day. And he sent me this email. I'll read you a bit of it. I'm dying to get out into the field again. When the book's editing is finished, I want to do something really ambitious, like spending 5 years retracing the first human colonization of the planet on foot. In essence, the story of our species, delivered as the ultimate travel log. Ludicrous, I know, but I'm possibly insane enough to do it, and maybe blog about it as I inch along. It's either that or find another war. Anyway, it's an idea I'd like to bounce around with you. Well, we all know Paul isn't insane. And it's very rare in life, I think, that we encounter an individual who, by virtue of his character, his ethos, his courage, his generosity, his grace, and if you like, his general good guyness, inspires us to reach in ourselves and come up with something better. And I think many of us are in this room tonight because we've been touched in that way by Paul. And so I know, Ann Marie, you've mentioned some of Paul's partners, but I want to just repeat that list because I think it bears notice that in the time that he spent planning this, he's had such an effect on so many institutions and has wrapped in so much talent and support for this project. I'm delighted that the journalism and digital content surrounding the walk are supported by the National Geographic and the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation. By the way, the project website launches today at outofeldenwalk.com. That's all one word, outofeldenwalk.com. His other partners are Project Zero here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, the Pulitzer Center for Crisis Reporting, the Knight Science Journalism Fellowship Program at MIT, and the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago. Finally, before I give you to Paul, I just want to thank you, Paul, for stimulating all of us to think about what we do in new ways. And I'd personally like to thank you for enriching my life in all of these years. Over to you.